The foundational texts of the world's major faiths explicitly mandate peace, charity, and universal brotherhood. Yet, examining the historical record reveals a stark mechanical reality. These identical belief systems operate as the primary unifying forces for the most devastating wars ever fought by human beings. The assumption that global secularization would dissolve this association has proven false. Over the last 40 years, political and territorial conflict organized around religious identity has aggressively expanded. Global demographic data confirms that religious adherence is experiencing massive compounding growth. This expansion keeps organized faith squarely at the center of domestic policymaking and geopolitical warfare. Confronted with this persistent violence, modern critics often argue that religious belief is a cognitive misfire. They frame it as an evolutionary accident or a parasite of the mind that tricks otherwise rational humans into illogical, destructive behavior. Evolutionary sociology approaches the data differently. From a strict biological and sociological perspective, traits that consume massive amounts of resources and demand immense personal sacrifice do not survive across thousands of generations by accident. They survive because they are highly selected, functional adaptations. The persistence of religion points to a specific utility. It is a highly optimized technology for group cohesion and warfare, engineered by millions of years of distinct selection pressures. To understand the mechanics of holy war, we have to build a functional model of human belief from the ground up. That requires tracing a line from the neuroanatomy of ancient primates directly through to the macrosociology of modern institutions. Making sense of the violence committed by religious institutions means looking past their written doctrines. The real answer lies in the brutal biological and ecological pressures that built the human brain to fight. Cladistic analysis of our great ape ancestors provides our baseline. These ancient primates lived in dense African forests and exhibited a specific social structure. They lacked permanent groups, favored weak social ties, maintained loose territories, and prioritized high individual autonomy. Roughly 14 million years ago, those dense forests began receding. This environmental collapse forced these highly individualistic hominins out of the trees and onto the expanding, predator-rich African savanna. Surviving this open country environment demanded a drastic, immediate behavioral shift. To avoid extinction by predators, these solitary apes needed to lock together into cohesive, defensive groups. Look at these fossilized hominin cranial casts. They show the structural similarities in brain cavity size among the older fossil specimens. For millions of years, the neocortex, the center of intelligence and complex thought, did not significantly increase in volume. Evolution did not solve the survival crisis by making hominins smarter. The biological mechanism occurred deeper. Natural selection doubled the hominin subcortex, the ancient center where emotions are generated. Expanding this palette to moral emotions like guilt and shame created the necessary hardware, giving apes the capacity to form durable social bonds. The neurological capacity for religion emerged as a byproduct of a specific evolutionary adaptation, a biological mechanism designed to force autonomous apes into social bonds. These new neurological bonds were absolutely required to survive the brutal conditions of the African savanna. Even equipped with new emotional bonds, early human hunter-gatherer bands were structurally fragile. Without biological programmers for permanent grouping, these communities were highly vulnerable to internal fracturing. This introduces what evolutionary sociologists call Spencerian selection. When a population faces a severe adaptive problem, like the constant threat of group collapse, they must invent new sociocultural formations, or superorganisms, to survive. To function, these early superorganisms, nuclear families and bands, required a powerful top-down regulatory system to manage food production, reproduction, and internal behavioral control. As human cognitive abilities slowly expanded, the brain developed the capacity to attribute causality for the harsh physical environment to supernatural forces inhabiting a secret, invisible realm. Belief in supernatural forces supplied an unbreakable moral code. With gods acting as monitors, the threat of guilt and shame is weaponized, instantly stabilizing the group. Religion became sociocultural software running on the brain's hardware, regulating the population far more strictly than simple biology. The first human societies institutionalized religion because their survival depended on an invincible, supernatural enforcer to prevent internal collapse. Once hominins formed stable groups and secured their position on the savanna, the environment shifted again. The primary predators threatening their existence became other competing human groups. Intergroup warfare presents the ultimate collective action problem. Rational self-interest dictates fleeing from lethal danger to preserve your own life. But if everyone calculates the same risk and flees, the group is slaughtered. To survive constant predation, human groups required a psychological mechanism powerful enough to completely override individual cost-benefit analysis. Religion operates as this precise mechanism by generating a supreme social identity. It subsumes the individual, stripping away self-preservation to ensure the group's survival. It introduces a system of supernatural rewards. Concepts like martyrdom and eternal salvation alter the equation of combat, outcompeting the ultimate material cost of death. Religious conviction justifies the cause and explicitly dehumanizes the enemy. Framing opponents as agents of an opposing supernatural force neutralizes evolved hesitations about killing them. Consider a simulation of two warring factions. Group A operates on rational logic, breaking and scattering when casualties rise. Group B operates on supernatural conviction, locking together and pushing forward despite the losses. The dedicated group annihilates the rational group. Historical data repeatedly bears this out. In the 7th century, the explicit codes of early Islam rapidly unified disparate, self-interested Bedouin tribes into a streamlined military machine capable of unprecedented territorial conquest. This psychological utility is just as active today. Religious conviction remains a primary tool for steeling combat troops against the terrifying realities of modern battlefields. The exact neurological mechanisms that make religion a source of profound in-group empathy simultaneously configure it as humanity's most perfected psychological weapon for out-group destruction. Scaling up to the macro-sociological level, established religions eventually begin to operate as massive superorganisms. They actively seek survival and expansion within specific geographic and cultural resource niches. This introduces Durkheimian selection. Religious organizations must compete in quasi-markets against other faiths to secure vital resources like loyalty, political influence, new members, and capital. As ecological density increases within a specific niche, the competition for those limited resources becomes extremely fierce. This intense ecological competition forces religions to constantly refine their moral ideologies and amplify their emotion-arousing rituals just to maintain their existing demographic base. When competition for niche dominance escalates into physical violence or the pursuit of total state control, the sociological model shifts into Marxian selection. Under Marxian selection, religious institutions drop their defensive postures and mobilize into social movement organizations, directly attacking competing institutions and governments to secure an absolute monopoly. These religious organizations enter the conflict possessing pre-weaponized resources, massive wealth, strict ideological purity, charismatic leadership, and vast, highly committed demographic networks. This mechanical process explains modern theocratic revolutions. Highly organized, deeply committed religious sects systematically outcompete looser, economically motivated confederations to seize absolute power. It also maps the sudden rise of violently uncompromising militant groups. They emerge rapidly from the chaos of resource-starved civil wars, precisely because they utilize the organizational templates of religion to mobilize bodies and capital. Holy war is not a perversion of religious structure. It is the predictable ecological outcome of massive religious superorganisms fighting to dominate a saturated resource niche. The complete evolutionary stack reveals a mechanical architecture of religion, where each distinct survival pressure built directly upon the last. Layer 1 is the Darwinian biological foundation, the immense subcortical emotional growth that wired primitive apes for sociality. Layer 2 introduces the Spencerian sociological pressure, forcing those raw emotions into regulatory, supernatural institutions to prevent the human group from collapsing. Layer 3 is the Durkheimian ecological pressure, dictating how these religious superorganisms compete in crowded markets for resources. Layer 4 is the Marxian escalation into ideological warfare, as religions weaponize their structures for outgroup destruction, bound entirely by an absolute social identity. A religion cannot be fully understood exclusively by reading its texts. It must be understood by examining this multi-level architecture of human survival. The coexistence of extreme in-group altruism and violent out-group intolerance provides a clear, data-driven example of group selection theory in practice. This psychological technology provided the mechanism for a fragile ape to lock together, survive the savanna, and expand across the planet as a unified force.